Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cracking Addiction. My name is Dr. Fergal Armstrong, and with us today we have Jesse Ball. Hello, Jesse. So, just to remind everyone, you are a peer support worker, yeah? And you advocate recovery. Is that right?
That is correct. Yes.
Yeah. So, the last time we had a good old chat, you talked about the initial phase. You know that sudden switch when you suddenly realized that recovery was attractive, and you talked about how the people that you met at the right time were were said the right things to you. I just wanted to follow on on a different conversation where you realized that the reason for your substance use was no longer valid. So you talked about your girlfriend that split up with you at the age of 18, and then you mentioned, well, if you're able to tell us a story about that conversation you had with someone when you were 25. And then we'll move on to the hard yards of recovery after that.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, it's a funny story, really. I was going over
I
to
think
a
it's a
friend.
funny story.
I was going to a friend's house who he didn't really use drugs after work. He didn't really care that I did. I think he thought it was annoying, but I'd go to his house to use drugs because I couldn't go to my parents' house. And I was nice enough that they let me come around, and he lived with his partner at the time. But she kind of got sick of me going around there and using drugs every day after work. And one day she goes to me, she's like, "Why do you use drugs after work?" Because for her it was quite a strange thing to do. And I don't know why, but my immediate response was, "Oh, my girlfriend broke up with me, and I'm hurt, so I've got to use to deal with the pain." Now, I don't think I directly said it like that, but that's sort of what came up from the conversation. And she goes, "When did you break up?" I'm like, "Oh, when I was 18." I was 25 at the time when this was happening. So it was 7 years later, I was still using over the same wound. So
Did
that's a
that
pretty
did that
classic.
trigger any change? Did that trigger any change in you at the time, or were you still not ready to consider a recovery?
I think it just made me angry or frustrated. I,
Yeah.
although there was a slither of, maybe she's right. It didn't really make sense to me. And that was a common trend throughout my whole addiction. It didn't really make any sense at the time.
Yeah. You made a comment to me again in another forum and we were talking about the role of trauma in persisting with substance use. And I think it's very easy for people to use the fact that they've been traumatized to justify their continued substance use. And really, you said you have to validate the emotional intensity, but you cannot validate being a victim. Talk to me about that. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, well, it's something I heard recently, which makes a lot of sense to me. But I
Hmm.
guess firstly, like for me, I definitely use that. Like you said, it was a huge justification.
Yeah.
Because to face the reality that I was self-destructing by using drugs, I don't think any addict can face that. It would make no sense. So we find ways to justify and rationalize our behavior. And a great one is just to
Mm.
blame someone else, right? Blame mum and dad for
Yeah.
our rough upbringing. Blame that ex-girlfriend who slept with our friends. Blame a shitty teacher we had. Blame losing the job. Blame the boss rather than take responsibility for it. And
Yeah.
this idea of not validating someone's trauma. What I meant by that was if we can validate people's trauma. This is just what I've heard, and this is something that sits well with me. We don't want to validate someone being a victim, but we can validate what happened to them. Because if we validate that they're a victim and all these bad things have happened, and they keep telling themselves that, and we sort of reinforce that for them, then they're going to feel disempowered and like there's nothing they can do. I think you mentioned on a previous episode that locus of control. It'll reinforce the fact that they're powerless and
Mm.
they can't do anything
Yeah.
about the fact they're a victim.
Yeah.
When it's simply not true. Well, we all have the power to
Yeah.
change our lives.
I think that word power has also triggered in me an issue that I want to bring up with you. I mean, we are both passionate advocates for the 12-step program. I don't think that's any secret. One of the criticisms I've had about the 12-step program is people say, "Oh, I don't like the fact that people think I'm powerless." I want to make it clear that, in my view, the first line of the first step of the 12 steps, which is we acknowledge that we are powerless over the substance and that our lives have become unmanageable. That's about our relationship with the substance. It's not about our relationship with ourselves. We are still very powerful. And someone said to me, who was an avid anti 12 stepper, "I'm not powerless because I'm seeking help." Well, that is true. You are powerful if you are seeking help. You are powerful if you are dealing with your past trauma in a productive and healthy way. But what the first step of the 12 steps is trying to get through is this idea that when it comes to your relationship with that particular substance, really controlling it on your terms hasn't worked. And so that's why you're in the mess that you're in, because the other half of that first step is that your life has become unmanageable. What do you think about this word power in that context?
I think it's a bit of a paradox, and the first step in 12 step fellowship explains this. Once we admit that we're powerless over drugs, not what we can do about it, specifically that we're powerless
Mm,
over the addiction, then we're actually empowered to do something about it. And for me, that was a really
yeah.
embodied experience. It wasn't just saying it out loud, I'm powerless. What that looked like was quitting my job and making my recovery my full time job, which at first was really scary. But once I did that, I did my step one, I wrote down the
Mm,
reality of my addiction, warts and all. I just faced it and I asked for help and I was actively engaging. That was my sort of admitting that I was powerless over drugs. And almost instantly, I felt empowered to actually do something about it. So yeah, it's
mm.
it's an absolute paradox. It doesn't. I can see how people get hung up on the idea of not wanting to say they're powerless, but it's actually a really empowering thing to do once you do it.
Yeah. I mean, I think that by their ongoing presenting to treatment services, they have manifestly failed to control their use of drugs.
Mhm.
And I don't know how else you describe the inability to control your drug consumption other than being powerless over that substance. But I like what you said, that actually, when you acknowledge your own powerlessness, it becomes very powerful for you. There's that paradox again, isn't there?
It really felt like for me, it was this experience of letting go. Like I felt like a huge weight was just dropped. And I was like, oh, now I can just stop kidding myself. I can stop lying and actually like speak to someone honestly. Because for me, when I was holding on to trying to control my addiction, I was also holding on to all the lies, all the secrets, all the tension in my body. It was just like gripping onto you know, my dignity. I don't know what it was, but it was really hard. But then when I let go and said, you know what, like I actually can't use drugs successfully. I'm not saying that was easy, but once I was able to do that, it really opened
Mm,
the door up for me to feel
yeah.
empowered.
Yeah. The phrase, "I cannot use drugs successfully." Yeah. What would that look like if someone could use drugs successfully?
Okay. I don't know. For me, I've kind of just completely abolished that idea in my head. But what I do hear a lot, and for some
Okay.
people, this might be true. Just being able to enjoy the occasional drink or use of drug on the weekends at a party.
When I ask people what do they want to do with alcohol, for instance, half of them will say, "I want to abstain." Great, we'll help you abstain. The other half say, "Oh no, I want to do controlled drinking. I just want to be able to drink normally." That's, and that means to them maybe having a couple of drinks on a Saturday night and then stopping. So I suppose really it's the same with other drugs, isn't it? This desire to feel in control. But this isn't what people who have a substance use disorder do. So one of my friends in a group that I run actually said that people who have never had a problem with an addiction, they don't come up with strategies to control their substance use. They just go out and have a couple, stop and go home again. They don't say, "Oh, I'm only going to drink beer. I'm only going to drink in company. I'm only going to have two. I'm always going and I'm going to have a glass of water in between." You know, People who genuinely don't have a problem, that just doesn't enter their minds. Whereas people who have that problem and are in the process of trying to control their substance use, those are the techniques that they use to ostensibly achieve that control. But I think really it's I think it's a hallmark of addiction.
Yeah, I'd agree. And you raise a really good point. Like, I know for me, it wasn't like I woke up one day and I'm like, all right, I'm going to create a strategy around my drug use and drinking. It was through years and
Yeah,
years of not being able to control it that I thought, right, maybe I should develop a game plan here because what I'm
yeah,
doing is
yeah,
not working. And then years
yeah.
again of trying to control that and plan it. And then I just had to accept that I couldn't. And what I was going to say before was, yeah, there's definitely a spectrum of addiction. I think most people can agree on that. And a lot of the stuff in 12 step talks about once you hit this threshold, there's almost like a point of no return. And once you hit it, then you can't come back. And
What is
that's,
that threshold?
oh, I'm not too sure to be honest. Yeah, I can,
So
I can
I would argue when your life is unmanageable, because if your life is manageable, then what are you doing in a 12-step program?
yeah,
You didn't realize you had a problem until your life became unmanageable, did you?
yep, yeah, definitely. You know, and I was
Hmm.
gonna say that might look differently for everyone, but for me, it was like I knew when things were getting out of control, and when I finally knew, they'd actually been out of control way before that. So, that's the other part of addiction. It's quite deceiving, so it can get tricky to actually know yourself when your life's unmanageable.
So you successfully saw the light because you realized that recovery was attractive, but you've been you know in recovery for how many years now?
Just over 4 years now.
4 years, right? So you've got a job, you're paying taxes, you're helping people, you're following your life path now, right? But it couldn't have been easy. So yes, you had that initial spark, I want to do something, but how do you sustain, certainly in the early phases, in the first year, for instance, how did you sustain that commitment to abstinence?
Another really good question. I think there's a lot of different answers to that. Like it wasn't one particular thing, but first thing that comes to mind is I did what was suggested by other people who are in recovery. And a part of that was 12 step groups, but it was also engaging with therapists and other people who knew how to recover essentially. So trying to keep an open mind and like fitness was huge for me, telling the truth, being honest, ongoing therapy to look at sort of what was going on underneath the surface. Often when people stop using drugs, all the stuff from the bottom bubbles up. So and then redeveloping, that accountability and relationships that was lost with family and friends. Yeah, for me, like keeping myself accountable was huge. I told people what I was doing. Yeah, they're the first things I think of, but there's heaps there. I could honestly answer that question for about 2 hours, I think.
Did you ever come close to relapsing?
I did in the early stages for sure. A week out of rehab, I wasn't a huge. That's a lie. I was going to say I wasn't a huge drinker, but in my eyes, I wasn't a huge drinker. I was mostly other drugs. And a week up when I got out, one of my friends wanted to catch up and have a six pack of beers to celebrate the fact that I got out of rehab. Because he thought he's like, surely you're fine to drink. And I remember like jumping on my phone, googling if you're allowed to drink alcohol out of rehab. And that
Yeah.
was pretty close. The only reason I didn't is because I spoke to someone else who was 4 months clean in recovery, and I asked him what should I do, and he just said it's probably not the best idea that you drink. So I didn't, and there were a few other times which I almost relapsed as well. But, I think, yeah, to be honest, it was probably just that time that was the closest I got, and every other time the reasons I didn't relapse is because I had that accountability and that support around me. So when I say accountability, just to elaborate on that, I had places I had to check into where people were expecting me present and sober. So that might have been a group therapy session during the week. It might have been family dinner on a Saturday night. It might have been, a doctor's appointment, an appointment with the psychologist. Like I had to be places sober.
Yeah. But that accountability was always there. There were always people around you that wanted you to be sober. So what changed? Why? My question, I suppose, is why does the accountability suddenly work when previously it manifestly didn't work?
Mm. We'll have to think about that for a moment. First thing
Or
that
is
comes
it
to
really
mind,
that when you
yeah.
go on?
Oh, I think shame is the first thing that came to mind. Like, shame for me when I was using drugs just kept me so distant and not able to show up or be accountable for things. And once I started to build that
Right.
positive momentum in recovery, like I felt like I sort
Yeah.
of came out of the shadows. Like people could see me for who I
Yeah.
was, and I was excited to show up.
Yeah. 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 That because there is a significant change, isn't there?
Mm.
Accountability was a mechanism of change for you, whereas previously it wasn't. So you're you're now 4 years in recovery. What do you do to maintain your recovery? What's your lifestyle like now?
So a few of the main things I do is I'm huge on my fitness. So I exercise every day. I'm into like prayer and meditation. I really enjoy yoga. Obviously, the work I do keeps me accountable as well, and constantly reinforcing this idea that I'm in recovery. um, I suppose like challenging myself to explore new parts of life as well, whether that be going on a silent retreat or um, traveling somewhere or trying new things generally. Like I've tried lots of new things in recovery, from you know combat sports to salsa dancing. Um,
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, let me just stop you there, right? This- Let's talk about salsa dancing. Because in my younger days, I fancied myself as a salsa dancer.
no, one step or two step.
So, are you saying that salsa dancing is the way to recovery?
Yeah, well, it's a part of it. So I'll explain that because it actually might be the case. So I was living up in Port Macquarie for a few months, and I was 18 months in recovery. The idea of traveling was really daunting, but I wanted to do it for my own spiritual growth. I went on a pilgrimage for 6 months. I traveled the east coast of Australia, which was a really scary thing to do. And on that trip, when I was living in Port Macquarie for a while, I met this French guy, and he pretty much sat me down and said, "What do you want to do in your life that you're afraid of doing?" And I said, "Well, I've always wanted to dance." And he's like, "You should go and do it." And I'm like, "But I'm embarrassed." And he's like, "Just do it now." And I called up a dance studio, and I said, "I want to come down and dance." She's like, "What kind of dance do you want to do?" I said, "I don't know." She said, "Salsa is a good place to start." So I went down, and I was just so like excited and nervous and uncomfortable, but it was fantastic. Like I did for over 4 weeks. I went there and I learned the basics. But I guess the point of this is like it was exciting. It was out of my comfort zone. I was around people. I was in a room of people I never met before, and for me, that felt like the opposite of addiction. It felt like I was embracing life, and doing things like that made recovery fun. It made it exciting, and it took me further away from my using. I don't know if I've gone completely off
There you
topic
have it.
there,
There you have it. Salsa dancing makes recovery fun. Discuss. Well, I'm actually thrilled for you because I actually, when I was younger, fancied myself as a bit of a dancer, and it was the crushing insight that I received when I realized that I have two left feet and have the rhythm of a snail it was a burden to my heart for a number of years. But I genuinely labored under the delusion that I was a good dancer for about 5 years. So yeah, and I can understand that the fun that you get when you're moving or trying to move in my case in rhythm with someone else to the music. So what else do you do to maintain recovery? I know one thing that you do. Let me just tell the story to anyone listening.
please go for it.
I happened to be walking by a McDonald's, just walking by, and a gentleman of the road came up to me and asked me for any loose change, and I said, "Well, what do you want the money for?" And I said, "Oh, I'm hungry." He said, "Well, I'll tell you what, I'll buy you some food. What food do you want?" And he looked at the McDonald's. I said, "I want some McDonald's food." Okay, so I went over there. I said to him, "Come with me." He said, "No, no, no, no. I'll just wait outside." So he waited outside. I went in and I bought this McDonald's Big Mac meal with extra Coke, extra fries, just calories, calories, calories. And I walked out of there and I couldn't find him. And I walked around the entire streets looking for this man, trying to give him his McDonald's meal. Anyway, I couldn't find him. And I thought, well, I had to carry this back into work. And I thought, who can I give this to? Which young man with a low cholesterol who's uber fit and burns through calories can I give this to? And I offered it to you. And what did you then do?
I think I said no thanks. I don't eat McDonald's.
You said, no, you don't eat junk food. I thought, well, come on, just this once. But no, you were adamant you wouldn't eat it. So I tell that story because really the commitment to a diet that is healthy and free of ultra processed foods, I think has got to be part of the recipe for people's recovery. People underestimate just how awful junk food is, just how bad it is for your mental state. And if you're in recovery, you do not need to be shoveling shit uphill, dealing with poor mental health, as well as trying to
Yeah,
recover and abstain
definitely
from
not.
drugs. So,
Definitely not.
stay away from the junk food. So, what
Yeah,
food do you eat?
I try to eat healthy. Lots of water, fruit, veggies. I eat meat,
Yeah,
and I eat like whole foods, but I eat healthy because like I need to. If I don't, I start to feel like crap, and it really
yeah,
plays up on my mental health. My anxiety will kick back in. I can get depressed. Like it's
yeah,
something I need to
yeah,
keep myself well,
yeah.
to keep myself happy. So it's kind of a blessing and a curse being an addict. Now I got to like go super healthy, or I'm gonna go super unhealthy. So I don't really have a choice. Well, I do, but I've experimented, and the choice I've made is the right one for me.
So, Jesse, on that sweet note, I think we're going to have to wrap it up. So, thank you very much for your time and expertise tonight.
Pleasure. Thank you.
That's all for today, folks. My name is Dr. Fergal Armstrong, and this has been Cracking Addiction.